to me. Okay, no, this is what it.
We're live.
We're live. Hello. Sorry that it took us so long to get on. We had some technical problems this evening, but I hope, particularly the Toolkits students, are watching. And thank you very, very much for your patience, everybody else. So my name's Felicity Castagna. My last book was The Incredible Here and Now, published by Brio. I'm here tonight with Alice Grundy, who has done a lot of amazing things in publishing. She was with Brio Publishing for about 3 years, was it? 4 years.
Yeah.
For 4 years, and before that she did freelance editing for a number of different publishing companies. She also began her own publishing venture called Seizure quite a while ago, which published a print magazine and now is online and has a novella competition every year, as well as running many other really interesting projects, such as a flash fiction project and a number of great fiction pieces and interviews, even with authors, can be found there. At the moment, Alice has actually just launched her own publishing company called Brio. Brio, sorry.
That's right.
Brio, which we're going to hear much more about this evening. So welcome, Alice. Alice has a wealth of information to share about editing and publishing. I wanted to start this conversation by asking you, as an editor that's worked in so many different publishing houses, what is it that you look for in a book?
It's a really short question and a really hard one to answer succinctly. The most important thing for me is originality. I want something that I haven't read before. That's what it comes down to, and usually that's got to do with voice. More specifically, having worked at Brio for 4 years, which is a brilliant publisher for unearthing new voices and for developing talent and for bringing them into the world, particularly with Western Sydney writers. Ivor Indig has been working in Western Sydney for a decade now and bringing writers out of writers' workshops and into not just bookshops, but onto prize lists. So I really admire the work that he has done and continues to do. And with Brio, which has only been around for 2.5 months, something like that, it's important to me to try to publish books that showcase diversity, that are ambitious, that are interested in pushing Australian writing further, rather than just being comfortable and settling in, and things that are tidy and neat and bankable. So Brio is a literary list, which means that there's a bit more leeway to do things with a view to having an impact on the culture and being of interest in the longer term, rather than just being about sales, although sales are nice too, of course.
Is that why you started Brio? Because I know that you've worked for much larger publishing companies in the past. What might be the difference, say, between what an independent publisher, whether they be smaller or a bit larger, like Brio, might be looking for, as opposed to, say, someone like Penguin or Allen & Unwin?
It depends on the individual publisher within the publishing house, in part. But everybody wants books that win prizes, because if you win a prize like the Miles Franklin, now the Stella Prize has an impact on sales. The Children's Book Council Award, those limited number of prizes have an impact on sales, and so the publishers want those too. But when it's a bigger publishing company, and particularly a multinational, they have shareholders, which means that they are answerable to people in relation to their profits. Whereas a smaller publishing company usually has a different reason for being. So a publisher like Text or like Allen & Unwin is privately owned, which means that they have a number of people who are responsible for the company and who enjoy its success and clearly don't want to lose money. But it does mean that they don't have those sorts of pressures in terms of turning over profit, doing better year on year, those sorts of things. But it can also mean that they don't have the same degree of capital behind them. So there are the larger independent publishers like Text and Allen & Unwin, which have a bit of money. Particularly with Text, they had the huge success of Graham Simpson a few years ago, with the Rosie Project, and that sold hundreds of thousands of copies and is now being made into a Hollywood movie. And so a book like that can really underwrite a publisher for a number of years to come. Whereas a smaller publisher, for instance, Transit Lounge published this year's Miles Franklin Award winner, Black Rock City. So that book will underwrite a lot of the publishing that Transit Lounge will be able to do for the next few years. But it usually, the smaller the publisher, the more idiosyncratic the list. So every publisher has their own vision and their own ideas about the kinds of things that they want to publish and their personal tastes. So the bigger the publishing house, the more publishers there are, the more diverse the kinds of publishing that's done, potentially. But it's often the smaller publishers that are making more risky decisions and being more experimental and playful in their choices.
That was a great answer. I want to discuss that further with you. I want to point out to people who might be watching that you can also ask us questions if you go to Express Media's Twitter and use the hashtag #EMToolkits. We were having an interesting discussion before we actually went live on air, where Alice was saying we're publishing this book and this book and this book, which is commercial. And I was interested in how you actually distinguish between what is, you know, a non-commercial book and a commercial book, and what is the balance for you?
So Brio is housed at a publisher called Zoom, and Zoom, you can see that for the past few years has published a book by Adam Spencer each year, which is, and for most publishers, you can always point at the most successful books that they've published, which will show you how they're funding their operation, basically. And so Zoom has been growing a lot because of the success, in particular, of these Adam Spencer books, but also some other books. So that was partly why they brought me on. The company wanted to expand. And so Brio is particularly the list that I'm working on. But the thing with publishing literary books is they don't sell a huge number of copies. The comforting thing is that per capita, Australians are really good at reading good books. So compared with the States, we punch so far above our weight. They're 10 times the size of us, whereas a literary book will sell roughly the same amount here as it does there.
Really? I didn't know that. I'd never heard that before. Yeah. That's so interesting.
So it's kind of comforting. One of the biggest, not biggest, but to my mind, one of the most influential literary journals in the States is called M+1.
I know that one, yeah.
The sales for their literary journal are maybe double our significant literary journals, but it's certainly not 10 times.
Very much.
It's not.
For those of you who might not understand that, I would say, like, what statistics we're talking about here. Like, a literary journal in Australia would maybe sell 1,000 copies. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're talking about 2,000 copies in the States. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's subscribers rather than copies, but you know, it's in that ballpark. So with literary books, the first thing that you have to do is get them into bookshops, and that's how you can get them into the hands of readers. And in Australia, we lost a very important means of selling literary titles when Angus and Robertson and Borders folded in 2009 or 2010, whenever it was. Even though those bookstores weren't as good at selling literary titles as independent booksellers, they were still an important way of finding those readers. So we don't have those anymore, so we lost a really important way of reaching readers. And now it is almost exclusively through the independent booksellers that we love, of course. So it's really hard to get enough literary titles into the market to try to reach the audience. So that means that those books will tend to not sell a lot. And there are a few things that make literary titles harder to sell. Authors, not always, but usually tend to be a bit shy of social media. And social media isn't a guarantee that you'll sell more copies, but it can be useful for that. And also, it just means that you're publishing a book based on different criteria than just because you think it will sell copies. You might be selling it because you think it will encourage people to look at the world in a different way, or because it's experimental, or because it's pushing the limits of sense or meaning, or whatever it may be. But it might also just be that it's a book which is important and interesting, but that have a guaranteed market in Australia. So the first book that I published at Brio is called The Cosmopolitans by Anjum Hassan. She's a writer living in Bangalore, and she writes in English like a lot of Indian writers do. She's published by Penguin India. Now, despite the fact that there are a lot of Australians who travel to India and there's interest in India, we have a significant population in terms of Indian diaspora in Australia. Nevertheless, trying to sell books that are written by people other than the English or the Americans is pretty difficult in this country. So that kind of book is a risk, and you don't generally anticipate that you'll sell a bucket load of copies unless it wins the Booker Prize or the author wins the Nobel or something like that. Those are the instances where...
And if it did, then you could publish anything you want, right? Because you'd have enough money.
Yeah. Well, the book is a bit magic. Not every year, but a lot of years it will mean that you can sell 40,000 copies of that book.
Mm-hmm.
So a best-selling literary title in Australia would be 5,000 copies.
Mm-hmm.
That would be significant. So just to give you an idea of how important something like the Booker is. So if you have something like The Cosmopolitans, I think it's important and interesting and useful, not to mention the fact that I think it's a really good book. But you're not anticipating that you'll make a lot of money off something like that. And so this is the 80-20 rule in effect, which I think is called the Pareto Principle, where 80% of the profits are made by 20% of the books that you publish.
Okay.
And sometimes people say, oh, well, if it's only 20% of the books that make money, why don't you only publish those? Well,
do you always know what they are?
No. That is precisely why that doesn't happen. And the multinational publishers publish books that don't sell as many copies as they would like. So it's for everybody, it's a risk and a gamble. Now, I hope that the literary titles that I publish explode and do brilliantly well. At Giramondo, Alexis Wright's Carpentaria won the Miles Franklin, and it went on to sell in the tens of thousands. Now, that was wonderful for a few reasons. One, because it's an incredible book and I think everybody should read it. But it also meant that it afforded the company opportunities to expand its publishing program. So you never know for sure that a book will sell a bunch of copies, but when I'm looking at a commercial title, it means that I'm thinking it can sell between 5,000 to 10,000 copies straight up, and it wouldn't be entered in awards, and it can go into
5,000 to 10,000 copies straight up. Where would these markets be? That's what I mean, when you're talking about how small the market is and how there's no more books. I mean, I know, for example, that whole idea of independent bookstores, like there's no independent bookstores in the western suburbs. So that's not even an option for a lot of us kind of local authors. They're very kind of inner city centric. So where's the market for that?
Well, the biggest retailer of books in Australia is Big W. There's probably a Big W in
there's definitely a Big W, yeah.
And there are a few things at play when you, so that's called a discount department store, and you also put Kmart and Target in that bracket. And they're a bit difficult for publishers because they buy in large quantities, so they have more negotiating power. And
then you have to print in large quantities and be willing to take that risk.
And then if it doesn't sell, one of the quirks of the publishing industry is that publishers and booksellers operate on a sale or return basis. So a bookseller is shown a list of titles 4 months in advance, and they say, I would like to take these titles in these quantities. And then the book is printed, and usually the quantities are based on what the booksellers say that they will take. The books are sent out, and if after 3 months the books don't sell, the bookseller can send them back to the publisher and not pay a cent. Sometimes freight, but it's not a significant cost for them. It is in the sense that if the books don't sell, then they've given floor space to something or shelf space to something that could have been given over to something else. But from a publisher's perspective, the booksellers have a relatively low risk situation in that they can send back things that don't sell. And I can't actually name another industry that works on that sort of semi-consignment like that. So when you say they order in large quantities, they can send them back, that's doubly bad for publishers because it means that or for a start, the books didn't sell and they didn't make the money that they thought that they would make. But further, they have to then pulp the books that didn't sell, which means paying money for books to be destroyed, which is terribly depressing.
Yeah, terribly depressing. What a horrible thought. So then do you expect, I mean, going back to your thoughts on social media, do you then expect as a small publisher that your authors will do more of their own self-promotion than, say, a larger company might expect? Or does everybody expect that? What exactly is self-promotion? Like, what do you expect authors to do?
I think every publisher expects authors to do self-promotion now. And the large publishers just as much as the small publishers. The bigger the publisher, the more staff they have, the more likely they will have dedicated publicity and marketing staff. But that said, not every book gets a dedicated publicist, a dedicated marketing plan. So there's no guarantee just by going with a large publisher that you will automatically get those things. And also, even if they're trying to sign an author and it's competitive, and they will say at the time when they're trying to woo them, oh, these are the delightful things that we'll do with your book, and we can break it in a way that nobody else can, and think of all of the time and money and effort we will put into it because we love it and we love you. But other times, other books will come into the schedule which will supersede that one, and it will become less important to the publisher. And so some of that investment which they initially guaranteed may actually be rolled back. There are benefits to the small publisher in that their attention is not split quite so much. I mean, I'm a bit biased because I've worked with small publishers for the last little while. I can recognize benefits of big publishers, but I think you'll also see, if you talk to authors who've been published by big publishers, there are those who have had brilliant experiences, who are very happy, who are completely loyal, who will never leave. But you will also see a lot of the really top-selling authors bounce around. They might be with a publisher for 2 or 3 books and then move somewhere else. And it makes sense because if the point is to make the most money, then you can generally make the most money by switching publishers.
By moving around,
But you asked me a different question, and I started answering that one instead.
Oh no, I was talking about. But actually, I want to get back to that when I talk to you about editing and how much time you spend editing and that sort of thing. But I was talking about how important it is to publishers, both small or bigger, if there's a difference in terms of social media and self-promotion. I think maybe it's important though for us, particularly because our audience is emerging writers, to talk about like what kind of self-promotion is good. Like I often look at particularly like a lot of more emerging writers, and you know, they do all these like tweets and Facebook pages that are like, you know, like they get something little published in a magazine and then they retweet it a million times, and they're just like all these tiny little megaphones like online. And I can't imagine that that's that interesting to people, which is why to be honest, I don't waste my time doing it. I prefer to write. How do you, like, what is good self-promotion? Like particularly in those places that we kind of all know are the places where you promote yourself, like on Facebook and Twitter, and or you know, outside of that, like how do you promote yourself? Even not necessarily as like a published author yet, but maybe somebody who's building up their career, who might be publishing, you know, little bits and pieces here and there, and who's trying to build a public profile. Like what's the good way to not annoy people?
Like, I think the 2 most important things are to be supportive and to be authentic. So being supportive means talking to other people, retweeting your stuff that you think is interesting, actually reading what other people are writing.
So important.
If you can subscribe to the Drury journals, do, but if you don't have the money, you can read them at the library, or you can read the stuff that they publish on their websites for free. Or you can ask for a subscription for your birthday or something like that. But the key thing is to really engage and not just do it superficially, that you have to actually read something before you retweet it, or actually pay attention to it. And the second thing, being authentic, ties into that. If you hate social media, don't do it. It's a waste of everybody's time.
Yeah.
And it's so obvious. Everybody can tell straight away.
Because they're so kind of awkward and stilted about your conversation.
Yeah,
it doesn't sound that. I know that's like me when I try and tweet.
Yeah. And I mean, I can tell. So I edit Seizure, like you said, and every time I tweet about Seizure, people think I'm doing self-promotion, so I lose followers. Sometimes I gain followers as well, but more often than not, I lose followers because people think that I'm just big noting, I guess, or they think I'm being repetitive because, you know, I talk twice in 1 week about a project that I'm working on. So you sort of have to not worry too much about how many followers you gain and lose for a given tweet. And, you know, usually it is the most inane stuff that gets you the most attention. I think I did my most popular tweet ever last week, and it was saying how I'd switched from N dashes to M dashes. And people got so excited about that because that's what social media is for. It's for fluff. It's not, most of the time, it's not for serious engagement.
I tell you who I think is the best person on social media in the country, and you know him, is Walter Mason.
Yes.
By far. And if you want to see a successful, like an author be successful at self-promotion, have a look at his Twitter and his Facebook page. And he's actually got other, like he's got YouTube channels and a lot of different things. But the reason why he is so successful is because he has this philosophy that in order to promote yourself, you have to promote others. So basically, he just spends his whole time on social media, you know, putting up articles by other people that he thinks are really interesting and that he's read, by talking about, you know, books by other Australian authors that he likes, by, you know, promoting other people's and going to other people's events and that sort of thing. And that has brought him literally thousands of followers. Like he has a more, I don't know any kind of non-big international author that has as large a social media profile as Walter Mason, and he very rarely actually puts in stuff about his own books, but I'm sure that lots of people have read him simply because he's out there promoting them. And I've seen that on social media and in the real world, people turn around and promote his work all the time. So I think that he's an amazing model if you want to have a look at how, and even an amazing model for someone who's not necessarily published a book yet, but who is starting to operate in the writing world.
I agree. The other good one who comes to mind is Anna Spargo-Ryan, who also works in social media as a day job. So she is very knowledgeable. But I think there's a, you know, people talk about ratios of promotion tweets to any other kind of tweet, and it's, I think what I've heard is 10 to 1. I mean, you've really got to spend most of your time talking about other things. Also, text publishing has a really good Twitter account. One of the key things is personality. If you come across as just completely bland, then why would anybody read you or follow you or listen to what you have to say? So I mean, it's the same with your writing. You need a distinct voice for your writing to be interesting and for your social media to be interesting. And be yourself, because it's just too tiring and boring
to be someone. I agree. I remember actually reading an article by, I forget his name, but the guy who founded Twitter, and he said that the key to social media is brevity, frequency, and personality. And you know, that makes so much sense. Like, that's exactly how it works in so many ways. Can you tell us a little bit about process? So I know a lot of, like, our viewers online are interested in what happens to a manuscript, say, when they send it out to a publisher, and then after that they're interested in, you know, like, what happens to the slush pile, and then what happens in the editing process. Like, how closely do you work with an author? And can, you know, I mean, because you've had experience with large commercial publishers and very small ones, like, what might be some of the differences as well there? Can you tell us about that process of shaping an author's work?
Yeah. So there are a bunch of different ways that books come to be published, but we'll focus on the slush pile for now. So that means an unsolicited manuscript, when the manuscript comes directly from the author and isn't represented by an agent. And I'll just quickly say, I don't think people need agents necessarily.
I'd love you to just, maybe just segue slightly. Is it okay to actually send to a flash file?
Yes, absolutely. So when I started working in publishing, there was maybe 2 reasonably sized publishers that had accepted unsolicited submissions. Since then, basically all of them have opened up to it, because we don't actually have that many agents in this country, and agents often have very closed submissions, and some, but not all, tended to be a bit more literary, and so some of the publishers weren't getting the kinds of submissions that they wanted to receive. So that's part of the reason why publishers opened up. Also, a woman I used to work for, Louise Thurtell, who started Friday Pitch at Allen & Unwin, had I think 2 or 3 successes in the same number of years, and the other publishers set up and took notice and said, oh, we want some of that.
My own experience, just as an aside, is I had an agent for about 5 minutes and couldn't stand it. So. Didn't find it helpful at all.
Yeah. And you know, it depends on the agent. Everything, publishing is such a relationships game, such a interpersonal game, and it's so important to work with people that you respect and that you feel as though they have the best interests of your work at heart. It doesn't. They could be at a huge company. They could be at a tiny company. So you don't need an agent, and you can also get one after you get a contract. So if you submit your manuscript, a publisher offers to publish it, and then you get a contract and you can't understand it and you can't follow it, or you want some advice, you can then take that to an agent if you want, and they might be more interested in signing you then.
Or you can actually also get contractual advice from the Australian Society of Authors if you're a member, which you could also join if you needed contractual advice.
So you send in your manuscript. It's usually a sample as opposed to the whole thing. So somebody will read that, and people ask me whether publishers read every single manuscript that they receive. They do, and somebody,
like all of it, because that seems like a lot of stuff to read.
Not all of it necessarily, but somebody will read the majority of, or at least a decent amount of everything that comes in. So it will be read. If the person likes it, then it will usually go either to somebody else for their opinion, or it will, that the person who read it will get back to the writer and say, hey, we'd like to see more from you. Can you please send in the whole manuscript? You don't necessarily have to have a completed manuscript to submit if you're writing nonfiction. If you're writing fiction, you basically should have a finished manuscript before you submit it.
That's a really good point, because I know that I get asked that by emerging writers all the time.
And there are no hard and fast rules exactly, but that's a guideline.
I would also, can I add to that, you know, you really only get one chance. So it's not like you send off your fiction manuscript and the publisher, you know, sometimes this happens, but most of the time it doesn't happen. Like they just go, okay, no, or yes. So you don't actually have a chance to actually go back and edit your work again after you submit it. So you actually have to be really patient and submit what is absolutely your best work.
I agree completely. So they read that, and if the person in-house loves it, if it's a big company, it will then go to the acquisitions meeting. By this time, it will have been read by the person who reads the slush pile and the publisher. The publisher will take it to the acquisitions meeting. If it's a big company, it will have the head of publicity, the head of marketing, the head of sales, the MD, maybe the CEO, a few other people like that. And they will sit around the table and they will say, what is this person's Twitter following? What is their publication record? Do they have a lot of Facebook fans? Are they good talent? Which means, do they present well? Do they interview nicely?
Can they speak in public?
Writers Festival panels? Would they do radio? Would they do morning television? So this is for quite a commercial book that these sorts of considerations will come in. How prepared are they to contribute to the publicity effort and so on? Usually in advance of the meeting, a sample of the manuscript will have been sent around to a few people in the company. If you're lucky, a few of them will have read it. Well, if all of those boxes are ticked, then they decide to make an offer on the manuscript. How much depends on a gajillion different factors, and that's a piece of string question. But then an offer will be made, and the author can accept it or to try to negotiate or whatever else. Contract goes out, contract gets signed, and this is a very sort of sped up, easy version of the process. And then it goes into editorial. So one of the things that will probably be covered in the earlier stages is the publisher saying, these are the things that I think need to be done to your manuscript in order for it to be published. And it's a good idea to have that conversation before you sign the contract so that everybody's on the same page. And you also have an idea of how much work you're expected to do as an author before you start. So there are 3 stages of editing: structural editing, which is macro, which means plot, characterization, things like that. The second stage is copy editing, sometimes called line editing. So that means language, register, things like grammar and spelling. And the third phase is proofreading. In a really big publishing house, you'll have someone who's called a project editor, who will be responsible for the book over the course of its life in the publishing house, but they won't generally edit the book themselves. They'll be managing the freelancers who do each of those stages. In a smaller publishing house, you would tend to have at least some of the editorial done in-house. In a mid-size, it depends. And it could well be that the publisher does the structural edit. Then there's a project editor who handles everything else. It depends on the different scenarios. Before the proofreading phase, the files go to a designer who put it into InDesign, make it look like a book. Meantime, there's a cover being designed and things like that. Marketing plan being developed, publicity plan, and then it goes to print. And if you're printing locally, that'll take about 2 weeks. And if you're printing overseas, depending on if there's Chinese New Year in the way, which is something that I always have to have like in blaring multicolor on my calendar so that I don't miss it, that makes a really big difference. So if you're printing overseas, you're printing in Singapore, Hong Kong, or China usually, but usually in my experience, it's mainland China. So Chinese New Year, very important. And then you get the books back from the printer and they go out to booksellers in that process that I told you about before with the catalogs and the presentation of the titles. And then you find out whether the market wants it or not. So.
Which is always a gamble. Can you tell us a bit about the stuff that happens like way before really you maybe even get a manuscript together? Like how do aspiring authors develop their career and developing like a publishing profile before they even get to that stage where they can go and submit a manuscript to a publisher?
Well, I start by saying there's no one path, but a really good tried and true method is to work on shorter pieces, work on longer pieces, work on a full-length manuscript. And in Australia, particularly in the past 5 years, we have such a strong literary journal culture. And despite the fact that funds have been hacked out of the Australia Council and literary journals have less money, still they're surviving and in my opinion thriving, and they're in large part the reason why we have short story collections being published again in Australia. When I started working publishing, people weren't even accepting short story collections as submissions. Now you have books like Maxine Beneva Clark's Foreign Soil or Keredwin Dovey's Only the Animals, which have sold in nice quantities, and they've told publishers that these books can sell. And so publishers are signing and selling short story collections. And it's not just the small publishers. For a while, it was publishers like University of Queensland Press and Giramondo that were publishing short story collections. And now it feels as though there's more support from publishers like I published Abigail Ullman's Hot Little Hands last year or the year before last. And Fiona McFarlane's The High Places. So it's nice to see a range of publishers in the short story market. So that's another aside. You have to forgive me for going off on tangents.
No, I think it's really important because I think, at least when I talk to a lot of emerging writers, and I know in the Toolkits course, there's a lot of people who want to write short story collections. I mean, what makes a like a more commercially successful short story collection, or like a short story collection that a publisher would want?
It's the same things as any book, in my opinion. Originality and voice. And you might say, what's original? Isn't it just original because I'm me and nobody's me and I wrote it? No, that's not enough. So when I say originality, I mean showing the world from a different perspective, or coming at it from a different angle. There's a writer called Ryan O'Neill who's just had a book published called
I know his first collection of short stories was The Weight of the Human Heart. I think that's probably the most original short story collection I've ever read, actually.
They're brilliant.
I don't even know what this new one is about.
And this is a book where he has written fictional mini biographies of non-existent Australian writers. And it's so funny and clever and unusual, and it's a bit odd. I mean, I don't think it will be a mega bestseller, but in terms of its contribution to contemporary Australian letters, I think it's just spot on. So that's what I mean by original. It's something that you haven't seen elsewhere. Or in the case of Hot Little Hands by Abigail Ullman, the way that she, from the perspective of young women coming into their sexuality and trying to understand the world, I think that was original. So it could be original in terms of structure or form, in that it's doing something that is different in the format, like Kerrigan Dovey's Only the Animals. Every one of the stories was told from the perspective of an animal. So
which is incredibly hard to pull off, by the way.
Yes. And
to be honest, having taught a lot of creative writing courses, I don't know if I recommend it. I think Kerrigan Dovey totally pulls it off, but I've not seen anybody else do it.
Yeah. So having the form as your original element is really sophisticated and difficult to achieve. But it could be the content. So Luke Carman came and gave one of these talks
about originality and voice, which is and the reason why I made sure we had an entire lesson on that is because I get what you're talking about from a different angle, not even from the point of view of being an author, but from the point of view of being a writing teacher, and having taught, across creative writing in multiple universities and writing centers and all sorts of places. And I come across this thing all the time where so many writers are just like, they're technically good, like they've got a lot of skill, their work is it's very polished, but it's just not going to get published. And it's very difficult for me to explain to them that there are a lot of authors out there that have good technical skill now, because a lot of people are taking courses and things. But there's not a lot of authors out there who have the originality and voice of somebody like Luke Carman or Ryan O'Neill. And that's not necessarily, but I think all the time about writing a very different story, or even a different kind of story, I think, because there's so many, I don't know, like, there's only so many plots, and only so many kinds of characters. I think it's about the way that you tell the story.
Exactly. And Luke writes with this very unusual sense of humor and style and panache, and the way that he clashes sort of 20th century beat writers into Walt Whitman, into Western Sydney is just completely fresh and original and unexpected and beautifully executed. So that would be the version of originality in terms of content. So just going back, I mean, all of the writers like Maxine Beneba Clark, Luke Carman, they were published in literary journals, and there are writers like Fiona McClellan who weren't really. She was just published in the New Yorker, so that's fine. You can do it that way.
But look, having actually gone to university with Fiona McClellan, I know we were both actually studying. We both started out publishing in like the uni journals, and she sent me a little picture the other day of like a secondhand journal she'd found in a Salvation Army or something, and it was really interesting because it had all of the table of contents was all of these people who were like you know, 18, 19, 20, like we were at the time. And half of those people were now like have published really great books. So it was actually the most exciting thing I'd ever seen, really. Just like, oh, look at that. Like, you know, look what can happen in, God, I want to say like 20 years. Anyway, not that long.
So literary journals do that.
But yeah, and even the small ones, the smallest ones, you know, this is a very, very small kind of nobody read, you know, 300 copy kind of thing.
Yeah. So you develop your skills. It means so much to be read by somebody else. I had my first short story published when I was 16 in a magazine called VoiceWorks.
Yeah, I had one of my first stories actually.
It's for people under 25.
Run by Express Media, who you all know.
And they paid me to publish a short story of mine. Now they have a very different process. At the time, it went through it and there were typos in it and it wasn't really edited. Now they have this brilliant editorial committee who all work together and work incredibly hard. And those editors then go on to be key players in the publishing industry. So, I mean, I can't recommend VoiceWorks highly enough, but the pride that I had in having a story published. So there's that side of things, but there's also the side of things of people encountering you, the opportunity for people to read your work. Yes, publishers read literary journals and they find people that way. And it's also a way of when you come around to preparing your manuscript and your cover letter, basically every publisher or agent will ask for a cover letter to go with your submission. And if you can say, I've been published in these places, then it lets them know that you know how to follow rules, you know how to submit stuff. And
I was publishing stuff for about 10 years before I got my first publishing contract. It takes that long.
And also you learn how to work with editors. I think it's really good training.
And not only just like you learn how to work with editors, but you learn so much from editors. Like, I mean, I would argue, you know, like I teach writing because I'm a creative writer, but I would actually argue that the better writing teachers are actually editors. And I've learned much more from editors than I've ever learned from writers like me, quite frankly. Like, even now I'm in the process of editing my next book, and the you know, my editors pointed out all of these weird quirks that I have in my writing and annoying things that I do that I don't even notice. And that's, you know, that's I would never learn that in any creative writing course. Like, it's ever going no creative writing course is ever going to be that focused on the individual skills that you have or need. But you get that from, like, I got that as well when I was publishing in journals and magazines. Like, I remember I kept getting this comment, stop writing in the passive voice, and like I had no idea for years. I had no idea what the passive voice was, and it just kept coming back and coming back. And so eventually I like really did a lot of investigation into what this term meant, and it took me a long time to get my head around it. But once I got my head around what that was and could stop doing it, I became a much better writer.
The Cheats version I have for that, which I had stolen from somebody else that I can't even credit because I can't remember who it was. But they said if you can put by zombies after it, then it's the passive voice and you should rewrite it. So
give us an example.
So the book was put on the shelf by zombies. That's the passive voice. There are instances where you can put by zombies at the end and it's not passive voice, so it's not.
Instead of the book was on the shelf, or the book is on the shelf.
The thing with the active voice is you need somebody doing something to the thing. So the subject does something to the object rather than the object just magically having something done to it by some unnamed thing.
This is actually really important. It really is. In my own writing experience, it is. It's actually not an insignificant difference, and it does actually really improve your writing.
Yeah, it makes it seem really flat if it's in the passive voice. I mean, as the name would suggest, it makes it seem as though there aren't actually actors happening in the scene.
But this is something like I don't think that people get things like passive voice when somebody actually gets up or even is on a video like this, having it explained to them. Like, you actually need an editor to go through. I just learned the difference between using the and that and those.
Well, and we don't teach grammar in Australia.
It's true, but nobody cares. Like, look, who cares about grammar? Nobody cares about grammar until you actually learn it in context. Like, you know, I've learned about grammar through editors, and I've learned about what grammar means to the creative writer, and therefore I've learned to value grammar. Whereas, you know, I don't know that I would before until I was told to value it and then could see how much of a difference it made in my writing.
It's a powerful tool which you can exploit.
Absolutely.
And, you know, as with anything else, there may be instances where you intentionally want to use passive voice because it will downplay something, or it will flatten something, or you might be using it ironically, so you use it to shift the tone in a passage. So yeah, there are times you might use it that way. So just to dial back to the point of the value of being published in literary journals, the people who edit those usually have experience in a bunch of different other kinds of editing. Not always book publishing, but usually other kinds of editing. And the reason that they work on the literary journals is because they're passionate about it and they love it and they care about it. So that's how they end up doing it. When I started Seizure, I was an assistant at Allen & Unwin, and I really wanted to do proper meaty editorial work, and I was too junior and they wouldn't give it to me. So I said, well, fine, I'll just start my own literary journal with all the hubris of a 23-year-old, or however old I was. But the great thing about working on projects like this, and now I love bringing in people that age and younger to work with me on Seizure, because I've been doing it a little while longer, and there are some things that I know that I can teach them, and there are always things that they can teach me.
Hey, that's a really good point, actually. I think, you know, one of the great ways to learn about publishing can actually be to go and work on a journal, or to do some kind of internship. Like I know I was never actually interested in working in publishing because my grammar's crap and I know that no one would employ me. But you know, I actually got a fellowship with can't remember who it was now. Allen & Unwin, I think it was Allen & Unwin, ages ago, and I got to basically just go and hang out and like look at what the marketing people did, and then read through the slush pile, and you know, talk to editors about what they did, and it was really helpful for me as a writer. Yeah.
Although I would also say, you know, sometimes people say to me, I want to be a writer, so I'll be an editor as my day job to earn money. It's really difficult to become an editor now. It's super competitive. You basically need a postgraduate qualification to be a receptionist. And then you do that for 2 years, and then you're an assistant for 2 years. And then if you're lucky, you might find your way into an editorial role. But it's incredibly competitive. And I used to write, and then I became an editor and I stopped writing, which I don't regret at all. And maybe one day I'll go back to it. But I can't keep the writing and the editing sides of my brain functioning simultaneously. Some people can, but I think they're in the minority. So if you really want to be a writer, then I recommend focusing on that and making your money any other way.
I often think writers should just do jobs that don't require brains, like packing things or something like that, putting things back on a shelf. I can imagine that would be a really good job for a writer, so that your mind could be elsewhere. I don't know why we all go off and get qualified to do different degrees. Like, just find something where you don't have to think, quite frankly, or get a trade. Tradespeople make heaps more money than you know, writers are most professionals, and you know,
and you can point to something at the end of the day that you've achieved. If you're a writer, you might write 3 paragraphs in a day, get to the end of the day, look at them, think that they're all rubbish, and have to start over again.
That's exactly
Whereas
right.
if you're doing something practical, then you might have something to point to at the end of the day.
That's exactly right. Okay, so I think we should be heading towards finishing now. I think what we should do is just maybe end with like, do your top 3 things that emerging writers should be doing if they want to be published writers later.
Number 1 is read and submit to literary journals, because that's a good way to get out there. Number 2 is to write as often as you can, and to find your practice. Some people write every day, some people set themselves targets, some people write once a week. Whatever it is, find the way that you like to work and then work that way. And then the third thing is to find people who are good at feedback. So you'll often get feedback from people who aren't actually giving you information or responses that are useful. It drives me nuts reading book reviews all the time. Somebody will read a book and effectively say, this was ice cream and I wanted a muffin. I hated it. You have to be careful of that when you're giving your work to other people to give you responses. So it's a trial and error process. There's no shortcuts, I'm afraid. And some people will be completely lucky and strike it with the first people they try, and other people might try years. So find people whose opinions you respect and get their feedback. And particularly if you're at school or uni, there are people who are paid to give you feedback, and they might get tired of it after a while, but use it as much as you can while you're there, because it doesn't come for free later.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Unless you're in Toolkits. Thank you very much, Alice, for joining us this evening. I hope everyone's enjoyed that. And I think that there was a lot that we could learn. There's a lot that we can, honestly, there's much more you can learn from an editor than a writer.
Well, different
things. So it's good to have an editor on.
Thank you. Bye.